In 1890 Minnesota, they thought he was just another enslaved boy, quiet, overlooked, easily forgotten, until he began saying things that hadn't happened yet. He warned of storms before clouds formed, spoke names before strangers arrived, described deaths days before bells rang. At first they laughed, then they listened, and soon even his masters started to fear what lived behind his calm, distant eyes. This is the forgotten story of a black slave boy whose visions unsettled an entire town, and whose future-telling gift couldn't be chained. The Mississippi River ran black under the November sky, its waters churning past the limestone bluffs of Minneapolis like a serpent coiling through the heart of the city. 12-year-old Samuel Washington stood at the edge of the Pillsbury mill loading dock, watching flour dust dance in the gaslight like snow that refused to fall. His hands, already calloused beyond his ears, gripped the handle of a grain shovel that seemed designed for a man twice his size. "Boy, quit your daydreaming and get these sacks loaded." Samuel flinched at the foreman's voice, but didn't look up. He'd learned that lesson his first week at the mill. Eye contact was permission for a longer tirade, and sometimes worse. Instead, he bent to his work, hefting 50-pound sacks of flour onto the wait-in wagon with a rhythm born of endless repetition. But he couldn't shake what he'd seen. It had come to him that morning during the pre-dawn walk from the boarding house on the north side where he lived with 11 other Negro workers. One moment, he was navigating the frozen mud of Washington Avenue. The next, he was somewhere else entirely, standing in this very spot. But the mill was silent. The great water wheels that powered the grinding stones stood still. Men with faces pale as flour moved in slow motion past the gates, their eyes hollow, with a hunger that had nothing to do with missed meals. In his vision, papers covered the mill's bulletin board, and though Samuel couldn't read most words, he recognized one, closed. He'd stumbled, catching himself against a lamppost, his breath coming in short gasps. An Irish worker had shouldered past him with a curse, but Samuel barely noticed. The vision had felt more real than the cold iron under his palm. It wasn't the first time. Samuel had been having the visions since he was 7 years old, back in Tennessee, when his mother was still alive. She'd called them knowings and warned him never to speak of them to white folk. "They already think we're less than human," she'd whispered, her work-worn hand cupping his cheek. "You show them you're different, they'll think you're dangerous or crazy. Either way, nothing good comes of it." His mother had died of pneumonia 3 winters later. Samuel had known it was coming, seen her grave in his mind's eye 2 weeks before she took ill. But knowing hadn't helped him prepare for the emptiness that followed. Their master, a tobacco farmer named Garrett, had sold Samuel north within the month. "Can't keep a boy who eats without earning," Garrett had said, though slavery had been dead for 25 years, and Samuel was legally free. But freedom and chains weren't always so different when you were Negro and 12 years old with no family and no money and no place to go. The Minneapolis mill owners had paid Garrett's transport and boarding fees, a legal fiction that meant Samuel was bound to work off a debt he'd never agreed to incur. 3 years of labor, they'd told him. 3 years, and he'd be truly free to make his own way. He was 6 months into those 3 years, and already he knew he'd seen the future of the mill. The only question was when that future would arrive, and what it would mean for him. Washington. Samuel looked up to find Mr. Brennan, the assistant mill manager, striding across the loading dock. Brennan was a tall man with mutton chop whiskers and a voice like grinding millstones. Unlike the foreman, he wasn't cruel, but he wasn't kind either. He was efficient, and he expected the same from everyone who worked under him. "Sir?" Samuel set down his shovel, wiping flour dust from his face. "The main grinding stone in the east wing is making a noise. Jennings thinks it's fine, but I want you to take a look." Samuel blinked. "Sir, I'm just a—" "You're the one who spotted the crack in the drive shaft last month before it failed. And you told Porter about the loose bearing on number 3 wheel the week before that." Brennan's eyes narrowed. "Either you've got the devil's own luck, or you've got an instinct for machinery. Either way, I'm not fool enough to ignore it." Samuel's throat went dry. This was exactly what his mother had warned him about. But refusing would raise its own questions and might cost him the small measure of trust he'd built. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. The east wing of the mill was a cathedral of industry, its ceiling soaring 40 feet above the grinding floor. 4 massive millstones, each weighing thousands of pounds, turned in endless circles, crushing wheat into flour with a thunder that made conversation impossible. The air itself seemed to vibrate with power. Samuel approached the stone Brennan had indicated, his heart hammering. He didn't need to listen for unusual sounds. He already knew what he'd find. He closed his eyes. The vision came immediately. The millstone cracking from its center, fragments flying like shrapnel through the grinding room, men scattering, blood on the flour-white floor. And timing, Tuesday next week, just after the noon whistle. Samuel opened his eyes to find Brennan watching him intently. "Well?" "The stone's going to fail," Samuel said. The words felt like stones themselves, heavy in his mouth. "The center's crystallized wrong, maybe from when it was quarried. It'll hold for a few more days under normal load. But what?" "Tuesday, when you run the full load, after the weekend rest. That's when it'll go." Brennan's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "And you can tell this by listening." "I can tell it by looking, sir. There's a discoloration in the stone, right there." Samuel pointed to a spot on the millstone's surface that looked to his eyes exactly like the rest of the granite. But he'd learned that his visions sometimes gave him knowledge he couldn't logically possess. "The grain's wrong underneath." For a long moment, Brennan said nothing. The thunder of the other millstones filled the silence between them. Finally, he nodded. "I'll have it checked. If you're right—" He trailed off, then seemed to come to a decision. "If you're right, there might be better work for you than hauling flour sacks." Word of Samuel's prediction spread through the mill with the speed of flour dust on the wind. When workers pulled the millstone on Monday and found exactly the flaw he had described, a crystallization fault running through the center that would have caused catastrophic failure, the whispers started in earnest. That colored boy knew. How'd he see it? Ain't natural. Samuel kept his head down and his mouth shut, but he could feel the weight of eyes following him through his shifts. Some looked at him with wonder, others with suspicion, a few with fear. It was the fear that worried him most. On Friday evening, as the first snow of the season began to fall, Samuel was summoned to the mill office. He climbed the wooden stairs with dread pooling in his stomach. each step taking him farther from the familiar safety of physical labor and closer to questions he didn't want to answer. Mr. Brennan sat behind a desk piled with ledgers and correspondence. Standing beside him was a man Samuel had never seen before, tall and thin, with silver hair and eyes the color of winter ice. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Samuel would earn in a year, and he studied Samuel with the intensity of a man examining a curiosity in a museum. "Samuel Washington," Brennan said. "This is Mr. Nathaniel Blackwood. He owns a share in this mill and several others. He's heard about your talent." Blackwood stepped forward, his movements precise and measured. "Young man, I understand you can predict mechanical failures before they occur. That's quite a valuable ability." Samuel said nothing. His mother's voice echoed in his head. "Never volunteer information. Never give them more than they ask for." "Mr. Brennan tells me you also predicted the bearing failure on the third water wheel and the drive shaft crack before that. 3 accurate predictions in 6 months. Blackwood's thin lips curved into something that might have been a smile. "That's no longer luck. That's prescience." The word hung in the air like an accusation. "I just noticed things, sir," Samuel said carefully. "Sounds that seem off. Vibrations in the machinery." "And the millstone, you predicted the exact day of its failure. You pointed to a flaw invisible to the naked eye." Blackwood leaned against the desk, his gaze never leaving Samuel's face. "I've consulted with 3 engineers since Monday. They all agree there's no way you could have known what you knew through ordinary observation." Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs. This was dangerous territory. He could feel it in the way Blackwood watched him, in the careful neutrality of Brennan's expression. "I'm a good guesser, sir," he said. "Don't insult my intelligence, boy." The word boy cracked like a whip, stripping away Blackwood's cultured veneer for just a moment. "I didn't build my fortune by dismissing anomalies. You have a gift. The question is whether you're smart enough to use it properly." "Sir, I just work here. I load flour and clean machinery and you're bound to 3 years of labor that I can purchase for a nominal fee." Blackwood straightened, brushing invisible dust from his sleeve. "I'm prepared to buy out your contract, Samuel. In exchange, you'll come work for me directly. Your job will be simple. You'll visit my various enterprises and tell me what you see, what's going to fail, what's going to succeed, where the dangers lie." Samuel felt the trap closing around him. "And if I refuse?" "Then you'll continue hauling flour sacks for 3 years, after which you'll be released with nothing, no money, no prospects, no recommendations." Blackwood's smile returned, colder than before. "You're a bright boy, Samuel. Surely you understand that opportunities like this don't come twice, especially not for colored boys with no family and no future." Brennan shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Samuel understood. Whatever authority the assistant manager had, it didn't extend to contradicting a mill owner. "I'll need to think about it, sir," Samuel said. "You have until Monday morning." Blackwood moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing, Samuel. I've heard rumors about other predictions you've made, personal ones. Tell me, do you only see mechanical failures, or do you see other futures as well?" The question was a test, and Samuel knew it. He thought of the vision he'd had just that morning. Blackwood, standing in a church, a coffin at his feet, genuine grief on his face, a young woman's coffin, judging by the size, daughter or wife. "I only know machines, sir," Samuel lied. Blackwood held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll see. Monday morning, Samuel. Make the right choice." After Blackwood left, Brennan sighed heavily. "Samuel, I can't tell you what to do, but I will say this. Blackwood's not a man you want as an enemy. If you refuse him, you'll find work hard to come by in this city. He has influence. And if I accept?" Brennan's silence was answer enough. Samuel walked back to the boarding house through falling snow, his mind churning. The other workers gave him a wide berth. Word had spread about Blackwood's interest, and now Samuel was marked as something separate, something other. He was used to being other for his skin color. Being other for his visions was somehow worse. That night, Samuel lay awake on his thin mattress, listening to the snores and rustles of the other men in the dormitory. Through the window, he could see the lights of Minneapolis glittering in the cold, and beyond them, the frozen expanse of the Mississippi. He closed his eyes and let the visions come. He saw himself accepting Blackwood's offer, saw himself traveling from mill to factory to warehouse, marking dangers, predicting failures, saw the grudging respect in workers' eyes turn to resentment, then hatred, saw himself becoming a tool, valuable but not human, used to squeeze profit from human labor, without regard for anything but the bottom line. But he also saw what would happen if he refused. 3 years of backbreaking labor, followed by release into a city where Blackwood's influence had ensured no one would hire him. Saw himself drifting south again, toward the lands where freedom was even more conditional, where Negro men disappeared into prison work farms for crimes they didn't commit. And beneath both futures, he saw something else. A third path, narrow and dangerous, but possible. Samuel opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling. His mother had told him the visions were a gift, but she'd never mentioned how heavy a gift could be, or how much it could cost to use it wisely. Monday would come whether he was ready or not. The question was, which version of Monday he would choose. Saturday morning brought bitter cold and a sky the color of old iron. Samuel reported for his shift at the mill with his decision made, though it sat uneasily in his chest. He'd spent Friday night in fitful sleep, his mind turning over possibilities like millstones grinding wheat. The mill was short-staffed on weekends, running with a skeleton crew to handle basic maintenance. Samuel found himself assigned to clean the grinding floor, a task he usually welcomed for its solitude. Today, though, he needed that quiet to prepare for what was coming. He was scrubbing flour dust from between floorboards when a shadow fell across his work. Samuel Washington? He looked up to find a Negro man in his 40s, dressed in the modest but neat clothing of a skilled tradesman. The man's face was weathered but kind, his eyes sharp with intelligence. "I'm Elijah Freeman," the man said. "I work over at the North Star Press. It's a newspaper for the colored community. Heard some interesting stories about you." Samuel's stomach tightened. "Don't know what you heard, but—" "Peace, son." Freeman held up his hands. "I'm not here to make trouble. Opposite, in fact. Mind if we talk a moment?" Samuel glanced around the grinding floor. They were alone, but that could change at any moment. Still, something in Freeman's manner suggested trustworthiness, or perhaps Samuel was just desperate for advice from someone who might understand. 5 minutes, Samuel said. Freeman nodded and settled against a support beam, casual but alert. I hear Nathaniel Blackwood wants to buy your contract, wants to use your special talent for his business ventures. Word travels fast. In our community, it has to. Freeman's expression grew serious. Samuel, you need to understand something about Blackwood. He collects people like other men collect stamps. Useful people, talented people, people who can make him money. And once he owns them, legally or otherwise, he doesn't let go easily. I'm already owned, Samuel said bitterly. Contract labor's just slavery with paperwork. True enough. But there are degrees of freedom even in bondage. Freeman leaned forward. Blackwood's had other workers with unusual talents. A Swedish engineer who could predict market trends. A colored woman from Louisiana who had a gift for reading people. Knew when they were lying, when they could be trusted. Both worked for him. Both ended badly. What happened to them? The engineer tried to leave after his contract was up. Blackwood made sure no one else would hire him. Last I heard, he was washing dishes in a workhouse. The woman, Freeman's jaw tightened. She disappeared. Officially, she returned to Louisiana. But folks say she learned something about Blackwood's business dealings that he didn't want known. Samuel felt cold that had nothing to do with the November air seeping through the mill's walls. Why are you telling me this? Because you have options you might not know about. Freeman pulled a folded paper from his coat. There's a community of Negro workers on the north side, skilled tradesmen, laborers, business people. We look after our own. If you refuse Blackwood's offer, we can help you. We have connections, people who can get you out of the city if needed, set you up with work elsewhere. You'd do that for me? You don't even know me. I know enough. You're one of us, and you have a gift that shouldn't be exploited. Freeman's eyes held Samuel's. But I'll be honest with you, son. If you go with Blackwood, we can't protect you. Once you're his, you're on your own. Samuel took the paper. It contained an address on the north side and a name, Reverend Josiah Thomas. Think on it, Freeman said. But don't think too long. Monday's coming, and Blackwood's not a patient man. After Freeman left, Samuel returned to his scrubbing, but his hands moved automatically while his mind raced. He closed his eyes and reached for the visions, trying to see farther ahead than he ever had before. The futures branched and blurred. He saw himself working for Blackwood, his gift sharpening, but his spirit withering. Saw himself becoming something between tool and prisoner, valuable enough to keep, but never truly free. The vision showed him wealth, more than he'd ever imagined, but it was wealth that could never be his own. That would vanish the moment he ceased to be useful. He saw himself fleeing with Freeman's help, starting over in Chicago or St. Louis or Detroit. That future was harder, full of uncertainty and struggle, but it held something the first future lacked: possibility, the chance to use his gift on his own terms, to build something that belonged to him. And then he saw a third future, the one that had haunted him since Friday night. This one began with acceptance of Blackwood's offer, but didn't end there. It was dangerous, requiring perfect timing and careful planning, but if he could navigate it correctly. Samuel opened his eyes and found his decision crystallized, hard and clear as winter ice. Monday morning arrived with fresh snow and weak sunlight. Samuel presented himself at the mill office at precisely 8 o'clock, knowing Blackwood would be punctual. The mill owner sat behind Brennan's desk, examining documents with the focused attention of a predator assessing prey. When Samuel entered, he looked up with an expression that was almost pleased. "Samuel, I trust you've made the sensible choice." "Yes, sir. I'll accept your offer." Blackwood's smile widened. "Excellent. I have the contract papers here. You'll sign over your existing labor agreement, and in exchange, you'll work directly for me. 3 years, same as before, but with considerably better pay and conditions. You'll travel to my various properties, assess their condition, and provide regular reports on any future problems you foresee." Samuel stepped forward to examine the papers. He couldn't read most of the legal language, but he'd expected that. What he needed to know lay in the future, not on the page. "There's one condition, sir," Samuel said. Blackwood's expression cooled. "I'm not in the habit of negotiating with workers." "Not a negotiation, sir. A request." Samuel met the older man's eyes steadily. "I'll need training. If I'm going to be useful to you, I need to understand business better. Accounting, market forces, how your enterprises actually work. Otherwise, I'm just guessing." For a long moment, Blackwood studied him. Then, surprisingly, he laughed. A short, sharp bark of genuine amusement. "You're smarter than I expected, boy. Dangerous quality in a colored worker, but useful in an employee." He tapped the papers. "Agreed. You'll spend mornings working with my secretary, learning the business side. Afternoons, you'll do your assessments. Evenings are your own, though I expect you to be available when needed." Samuel signed the papers with a hand that didn't shake, though his heart hammered like the mill's machinery. The trap had closed around him, but he'd chosen to enter it, knowing exactly what lay inside. Over the following weeks, Samuel discovered that Blackwood had been honest about the improved conditions. He moved from the boarding house to a small room in Blackwood's business building, barely larger than a closet, but private and heated. His meals improved from watery soup to solid fare, and every morning he sat with Gerald Pierce, Blackwood's precise and suspicious secretary, learning the language of commerce. Pierce taught him to read financial statements, to understand profit and loss, to recognize the patterns in Blackwood's various enterprises. Samuel absorbed it all, with the same focus he'd once applied to understanding mill machinery, knowing that each lesson brought him closer to his goal. In the afternoons, he traveled to Blackwood's properties throughout Minneapolis and its environs. Mills, warehouses, a small steamboat company, 2 hotels, and a sprawling lumber operation on the Mississippi's edge. At each location, Samuel performed his assessments, marking dangers and predicting failures with an accuracy that both impressed and unnerved Blackwood's managers. But he also observed, watched, learned. He saw how Blackwood operated, exploiting legal loopholes to bind workers to crushing debt, bribing city officials to overlook safety violations, using his wealth and influence to crush competitors. Samuel witnessed a system of exploitation that went far beyond his own situation, a web of control that trapped dozens, perhaps hundreds, of workers in various forms of legal bondage. And he saw something else, Blackwood's weakness. The mill owner's empire was built on leverage and credit, on a complex network of loans and obligations that required constant maintenance. He was wealthy, but much of that wealth was on paper, tied up in properties and investments that depended on Minneapolis's continued growth. Any significant disruption to that growth, any major economic shock, would topple the whole structure like a house of cards. Samuel began having visions of banks, of panicked men in suits, of businesses closing. The Panic of 1893, though he didn't yet know it by that name. An economic collapse still 3 years away, but coming as surely as winter followed autumn. By February, Samuel had been with Blackwood for 3 months. He'd earned a reputation throughout the city's business community as Blackwood's prophet, a title that made him valuable and vulnerable in equal measure. Some saw him as a curiosity, others as a threat. None saw him as fully human. On a bitter cold evening, Samuel sat in his small room, papers spread before him. He'd been secretly copying information from Pierce's files, carefully, sparingly, only taking records that wouldn't be immediately missed. Bank statements, contract terms, evidence of bribes and exploitation. It was dangerous work that could get him killed if discovered, but it was necessary for what he planned. The vision had shown him the path. Wait for the economic collapse, then use the evidence he'd gathered to break Blackwood's hold on dozens of workers simultaneously. In the chaos of financial panic, when Blackwood was scrambling to save his empire, there would be a window, brief but real, where organized workers could extract themselves from their contracts, could demand better terms or walk away entirely. But it required 3 more years of patience, 3 years of playing the obedient prophet while secretly preparing for rebellion, 3 years of watching other workers suffer under Blackwood's system while he gathered the tools to dismantle it. Samuel stared at his hands, no longer as calloused as they'd been at the mill, but still strong. His mother had told him the visions were a gift. She'd never said what that gift was for, or whether he had the right to use it to change futures rather than simply predict them. Outside his window, snow fell on Minneapolis, covering the city in white that would turn to gray slush by morning. Samuel thought about Freeman's offer, still available if he chose to take it. Thought about the other workers trapped in Blackwood's system. Thought about the weight of knowing what was coming and the responsibility that knowledge carried. He closed his eyes and reached for the future, searching not for certainty but for hope. The visions came, branching and uncertain, showing him paths that were possible but not guaranteed. Success, if he was careful and brave. Failure, if he miscalculated or if his luck ran out. But also the chance, fragile and precious, to use his gift not just to survive, but to build something better. When Samuel opened his eyes, the papers were still before him, evidence slowly accumulating like snow. 3 years seemed like forever, but he'd learned patience in the mill. He could learn it again. Monday would come, as it always did. But now Samuel Washington understood that he didn't have to face it alone, and he didn't have to accept the future he was given. He could shape it, carefully and deliberately, one vision at a time. The boy who'd hauled flour sacks was still there, still strong, but something else was growing inside him, something that might, in time, be called power. Or it might be called hope. Sometimes Samuel was learning there wasn't much difference between the two.